because that is considered there will be like influx of new high earning residents moving to that neighborhood. For real estate investors, they also care about the expense aspect of the property. So this is in the form of carrying cost. This can include property tax, mortgage payment, operation costs, and other building improvement costs, such as they need to replace the roof or the elevator. And then to the lenders and insurers, they don't care about the upside growth that much, but they are very concerned about the downside risk protection. So here we talk about there could be 100 million horrible things happen to a property. As the picture here shows that there could be a hurricane, could be fire, could be just a tree falling down the house. And then the lenders and insurance want to understand every little risk around that property so they can make really insightful and informed underwriting decisions. To our individuals, I guess we will own some piece of real estate sometime in our life, and we are also making the decision on the spectrum of income growth and risk expense. And let's take a look at specific building and ask some specific questions regarding the real estate data. So here are 4 common questions commercial real estate investors usually ask themselves. So the first one is, who owns the Empire State Building? Like, what land use is that zoned for? Like, how much did it sell for the last time in 2013? And what does the government think the Empire State Building is worth in 2019 to 2020 as a tax year? So I will reveal the answers to the first 2 questions so we can take a look at what the answers could look like. So Empire State Realty Trust actually is the owner of the Empire State Building. And then the land use for this building is C5-3, which is the retail frontage intended for offices and retail. For the last 2 questions, I like to open up the floor to the audience. Please just submit your guesses to the 3rd question, like how much do you think it sold for last time in 2013? Any wild guess is good. So we have 1 submission for 65 million. Thank you, Lucy. Any other 20 million from Mo? Anybody else? 500. Cool. Yeah, so yeah, Dempsey definitely has the most closest answer. Actually sold for 491.6 million in 2013, and currently the government Department of Finance thinks the market value is 967 million. And what do you think the taxable assessed value of the Empire State Building is? Just the context here, sometimes the taxable assessed value is not directly related to its market value, but this is what the government uses to charge the owner the property tax. Lucy, is that 200K or 200 billion? Or I guess it's 200,000. Yeah, it seems like audience has a low perception of the taxable assessed value for that building. Let's review the answer here. Yeah, so it's actually pretty close to what it sold for in 2013, but it's still half of the price of the current market value is. And hopefully during this presentation, you'll be learning all these tools that you can find the answers to these questions yourself. And I'll hand over to Cyrus to give us an overview of real estate data.
Thank you, Cho. For the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of how real estate data is structured, both in the city and on a broader level or nationwide. So to begin, I wanted to go over some of the more popular real estate or real estate tangent data sets that the city has to offer. These are all easily found through the city's main data portal, but they're maintained by a variety of different city agencies. So it can be a little bit convoluted when you're navigating between them. For example, you can find assessed property values, property tax information, and recorded transactions through the Department of Finance. You can find zoning and environmental regulation from the Department of City Planning. From the DOB, we can pull building level information such as permit data, complaints, construction materials, etc. We can even find energy use for every building above a certain size through the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And from the Housing Preservation and Development, we can find the number of housing units, jurisdiction boundaries, etc. The list of useful data sets is much, much longer than what's shown here, but this shows that the city has an incredibly rich ecosystem for exploring real estate. However, it's one thing to be able to find individual data sets. It's another to combine them to solve pointed questions, like the ones Cho had. For example, if I needed to combine the energy use for each building in a given neighborhood with each associated land use, how would I do so? This is where many newcomers to real estate data make a major mistake and try to join information by their address alone. Anyone who has worked with real estate data in bulk knows that addresses are incredibly hard to work with. For one, they are inconsistently standardized, they're prone to misspelling, and some buildings have more than one address or use alternate street names, as shown in the example here, where we have both 1211 Avenue of Americas, which is also known as 1211 6th Avenue. Joining simply by the address alone is incredibly hard to do and has to account for the numerous iterations of a name. Luckily for us, the city provides two alternatives. At the building level, we can use BIN numbers, which stand for building identification numbers. These are controlled by the Department of Buildings, go figure, and they're assigned to every single built structure in the city. So an easy way to think about this is every structure that would need a permit attached to it if there's construction, for example. So everything from the Chrysler building to a bathroom in the middle of Central Park has a BIN number attached to it. At the lot level, however, we use BBLs, or borough block and lots. These are managed by the Department of Finance, and they're a more common way of joining information across data sources in the city. To understand when to use each, it's helpful to understand their nuances and how real estate data is structured around them. So how exactly are BBLs structured to begin with? I wanted to use the use case of Empire State Building again here. And we can see that the left outermost digit refers to the borough code, in this case, Manhattan. The middle digit is, or middle integer is padded to have 5 characters, refers to the block. Then lastly, on the right, we have the lot, which is padded to 4 characters, refers to the tax lot. So important thing to note here is that blocks are not unique across boroughs, lots are not unique across blocks, but the BBL as a whole is unique. All right, so that's cool, but why are BBLs important to us? Most importantly, they identify lots. Lots are what the government defines as taxable entities, and it's how they track and evaluate property tax. So the most important real estate data we can find is attached to lots rather than buildings. Intuitively, this makes sense that where we find data is also the method or the scale that the government uses to collect that money. Some of the most valuable information for lots comes in the form of what we call assessor data. In New York, we call this AV roll, which stands for assessed value roll data. This is simply a standard document maintained by the Department of Finance that not only determines building characteristics, such as square foot and property type, but financials such as market value, whether or not the lot qualified for any exemptions, and what the total taxable value of the property lot is for a given year. There are many machine learning or valuation models that use tax assessor data as their backbone. Next slide. All right, so now that we have an understanding of what a lot is, the next question is how they relate to buildings. So while it seems like there'd be a single answer to this, that's not always the case. In the majority of the city, there is a one-to-one relationship, whether it's a single family residential sitting on a given lot or a large multifamily or office building on a given lot. However, this relationship tends to break down in higher density areas where we can have multiple buildings for a given lot. So if anyone's familiar with the American copper buildings on the east side of Manhattan, it's a good example because you have 2 buildings on a given lot that are attached in the air by a bridge. This is why bins are extremely important, because if a boiler goes out in one of those towers, the DOB needs to be able to track which building that is and send someone out to fix it if needed. In other words, they need to disambiguate structures on a given lot. However, to further complicate matters, you can have many lots for a given building. This is the case for condominiums. It requires an understanding of the difference between a building lot and a tax lot. So in the case of condominiums, you'll have one building lot for the entire tower versus each condo unit will have a BBL attached to it, which is simply the tax lot. So to dive into this further, I wanted to show how you would get unit level information. How that unit appears in the data has all to do with the type that it is. So for example, here I pulled out unit 501 for a condominium. If that's a condo, these units are assigned BBLs and they're thus treated as tax lots, meaning that we can easily find data for them. If, however, you own a unit in a co-op, you do not pay taxes directly, you buy shares in a co-op. I think Stuytown is an example of that, but that's a little more complicated, so we're going to ignore that for now and focus on condos. Whenever there's a transaction involving condo 501, for example, whether it's a deed or a mortgage, it needs to be filed within the city. This is what we've referred to as recorder data. In New York, we call this ACRIS, which Alyce will go over next. Like assessor information, recorder data includes physical characteristics like square footage, but also contains transaction level information like the transaction type, the amount, the date, and the parties involved. So this becomes increasingly important when we want to find granular information and not just on the building lot level, for example. Long story short, solely through using both recorder and assessor information, we're able to get a good picture of real estate entities across scales and time. And without further ado, I'll hand things off to Alyce so she can show you where to find these data sets.
Thanks, Cyrus. So we just went over, what is real estate open data, and then Cyrus also just explained how do we think about the data at an entity level. So what is a BBL and what is a BIN? And so now we're going to take a lot of these concepts and actually walk through some of the data sets that the city provides in order to answer the questions that Cho originally set up at the beginning of the presentation. So questions like who owns the Empire State Building? How much did it sell for? And what is the taxable assessed value of the Empire State Building? So at a high level, these are the 4 types of data sets that we're going to talk about that the city provides. So first we'll go over AV roll, which again covers the taxes that's provided by the Department of Finance. Then we'll go over ACRIS, which again records a lot of the transactions on a single property or a taxable lot. And this is from the Office of City Register. Then we'll talk about land use. There are 2 data sets provided here. So Pluto is the actual data set, but we also have an interface to kind of engage with that data set through something called ZOLA, which stands for Zoning and Land Use Map. And then lastly, we'll talk about the Building Information Search Portal, which is provided by the Department of Buildings. So first is AV roll. AV roll is released twice a year by the New York City Department of Finance. This is because property taxes are paid twice a year, and so we want to be able to update as the payments are coming in. It also includes the assessed value of every other lot in the city, and that's the base amount that establishes the amount of property tax an owner needs to pay. But property taxes, as we all know, is like pretty complicated. There's also exemptions, easements, abatements that ultimately affect how much the owner actually ends up paying, and all of that is available through AV roll. And AV roll is really nice because we can also find the owner for a given lot because they're the taxpayers. Sometimes there's often a lot of interesting exceptions, as we all know in the world of real estate. And AV roll also provides information going all the way back to 2008. So how do we access AV roll? So we click on this link. So all of these links for the portals are also in the one-pager that we sent out before the presentation. We can also copy and paste all of these links as we're going through the scavenger hunt. Anyway, so we click on this link, which is how we access AV roll. And we come to this page here. So on the right-hand side, we see property search, address search. So you can search by addresses. We can also search by BBLs, and we can also search by RUC. For simplicity, we're going to stick to BBL searching because that's the new concept that we learned today. In particular, if we want to find the information that Cho asked at the beginning of this presentation, we're going to type in the borough for the Empire State Building, which is Manhattan. Block is 835, and then lot is 41. And then this is the base page that we land on. So the property owner is the ESRT, which stands for Empire State Realty Trust, Empire State Building LLC. So the concept of property ownership is actually pretty interesting in real estate, especially commercial real estate, because a lot of owners will put their buildings in separate LLCs. And so it's actually kind of hard to figure out who the real owner is. That's a separate topic. Anyways, back to the Empire State Building. So we have the property address, which is 835 Fifth Avenue. We have tax class, which is something that the Department of Finance needs to track. And then the building class, which is 04. And that means, so O stands for office, and then 4 in particular means office with or without other commercial uses. So what's pretty interesting here is we can look at the account history and see how much the Empire State Building owners actually paid in property taxes. So in the year for 2021, it's roughly 43 million. Back in 2019, they paid roughly a little bit more than 40 million. And then to actually answer the question that Cho asked at the beginning of the presentation, which is, what is the taxable assessed value for the Empire State Building in 2019 to 2020? We have a section here called Market Values and Assessments, and then we can go to 2019 to 2020 final. Here we see that the estimated market value for the property was $967 million. The market assessed value is roughly $435.2 million, which is the answer that we provided. And then there's all these exemptions. So after you subtract some of the exemptions, there's the transfer assessed value, which is roughly $402 million. There's a lot more information we can play around with in this portal, and that will be part of the scavenger hunt. So next we'll talk about ACRIS, which is how the Office of City Register kind of records all the deeds, mortgages, leases, liens associated with real estate. So anything that's an official document related to real estate. And this is really cool. This is a really cool data set because it allows you to not only search property records, but you can also view the document images for any transactions going back to 1966 to today. So this is how we're going to access ACRIS. Here we have the portal link. Again, through ACRIS, there's many different ways that we can search for specific documents. You can search for a party name. We're going to go through the BBL approach again, but you can also search by a document type. So any sort of mortgages that in a particular area that you want to search by. There's also document IDs, transaction numbers, real and page, UCC federal lien file numbers. So a specific way to just search for federal liens. So we're going to go through the BBL approach, and we'll again plug in the BBL information for the Empire State Building. So 835. Oh yeah, you could also work with form numbers. Okay, and here are some of the documents that are associated with the Empire State Building according to ACRIS. Here we have, at the top, we have the New York City Real Property Transfer Tax. We have some agreements between the development agency and the bank BNY Mellon. There's oftentimes when a mortgage or any sort of loans are satisfied, that's also recorded here. So UCC3 termination is one of those, satisfaction of mortgage. And then at the bottom, we have the transaction here, which helps us answer how much was the Empire State Building sold for in 2013. So there's two options to look at this transaction. We can look at details and we can look at images. So first we're going to go through details. We see here there's document IDs, the type, and a lot of information regarding the actual document itself. And the document amount is for $491.6 million, which is the answer that we provided at the top of the presentation. And you can see here that the property was transferred from the estate of Leona Helmsley, and the Leona and Harry Helmsley Charitable Trust to the Empire State Realty Corporation. So this is one way that we can see what happened. This is kind of like a nice snapshot. And then we can also look at the actual image for the document. And the reason why we'd want to look at the actual image for the document is that there's oftentimes a lot more information on the document itself that's not available through just the snapshot that we saw in the view. And so what usually happens when a lot of these documents are digitized by the city is only a portion of that is actually created into structured data. And then another portion, a subset of that is then made available to the public for ingesting and looking at scale. And so if you want the most information possible, for example, contact information and title insurance companies associated with the transaction, this is where we would go to look at it. So these are the types of information that's available through ACRIS. We'll explore more in the scavenger hunt as well about all the different ways that we can look at the ACRIS data. So next we'll talk about land use. One of the data sets that's really important for understanding land use is called Pluto. It is maintained by the Department of City Planning, and a lot of the geographic features are maintained by the Department of Finance. It's really comprehensive, and it talks about all the different land use and geographic data associated with each tax lot. And there's three basic types of information. One is the tax lot characteristics, there's some building characteristics, and perhaps the most interesting is the geographic, political, and administrative districts. And this is important, and why it's maintained by the DOF is that, when you look at a physical property, it could be in one zip code, but then also fall under another municipality. And so when we look at all the different ways of segmenting geography for real estate in order to create and to evaluate the taxes on that property, it gets pretty complicated, even with like school districts or any major public works like highways or bridges that are being constructed. It's very easy to lose track of, which different geopolitical administrative districts actually influence a property's tax levels. And so having a data set that tracks all of this is pretty important. This data is also updated twice a year, and we can see that through the DCP website. If this will scroll. So New York City planning, Pluto and Map Pluto are different ways of looking at the data. So Pluto actually contains the structured information. Map Pluto actually has like a lot more regarding the geography of the data set. These are both CSVs and other flat files that we can download. And so in order to simplify our lives, we'll actually look at Zola instead, which is the New York City zoning and land use map. And Zola is a great resource, I think, for looking at anything real estate related for New York City, because not only is there a map that you can visually see, which lots are adjacent to the particular lot you're interested in, but you can also search by building names, addresses, and BBL. And so if we look at the Empire State Building here, it'll zone into that lot. There's a lot of information over to the right. So if we type in the Empire State Building, it'll actually give us the BBL information at the top. And so this is one way if you're trying to figure out, well, I have this building, I have this address, I don't know what the BBL is. We can use Zola because that's part of the process. And this process is called geocoding, which is going from one form of kind of geographic identifier to another form of geographic identifier. And so for the Empire State Building, here we can also see the owner, which is the ESRT Empire State Building LLC, which is what we saw in Acris before. We have a lot of information about the depth, the lot area, types of land use, building class. We saw this in AV role earlier. And then down here, there's a lot of interesting links that you can click, such as building information, which actually takes us to the building information search portal, which we'll cover next. We can also view all the Acris filings associated with it. So that's another way that we can get access to Acris without going directly to the Acris portal and plugging in the BBL. There's also permits, registrations, violations that you can look through here. So Zola is not only a great resource for finding out the BIN or the BBL of a particular property, but also helps link all the different disparate data sets together through the links that they provide. And then the last data set we're talking about is the building information search. This is data provided by the Department of Buildings. It contains all the information that you would possibly want to know about buildings, including complaints, summons, violations, permits, and applications. So anything that the city needs to approve in order for you to, improve a building, like that's all tracked with the DOB. Boilers, gas, power authorizations, obviously elevator devices, cranes, and derricks, anything that's like, major capital intensive projects. So the city is actually transitioning, in particular DOB is transitioning to a new system called DOB Now, but that's only for filings on July 1st, 2019 and after. And for the sake of today's beginner scavenger hunt in particular, we're looking at a lot of records that have occurred before that date. So we're going to stick to, this is how we access the BIS portal. So one way is obviously to just click through Zola. Another way is to actually go to the portal itself. And here we can search by property. So you can use addresses, you can do BBL, you can also browse BBL, browse by block and lot, which means you can pick a particular borough, a particular lot, and just look at all the buildings on that block. You can also search using complaints, violations, or summons with reference numbers, which might be helpful if you're making a complaint. There's also application searches. So for example, if your landlord filed to have something done for your property, you can also try to get those numbers and search directly here. So for simplicity, we're just going to do a BBL search for the Empire State Building again. And here we have a lot of information that the Department of Buildings tracks about the Empire State Building. At the top, there is a lot of physical information. So we have the address, we have census tracts, we have health area, tax block, tax lot, is a condo, the basic information that you would want to know. And then in the middle here, there's also like various documents that you can just view by itself. So certificate of occupancy is something that all developers need to have before they can even tenant the building. So you can just, validate that that box has been checked. So in the middle here, there's also information specific to the city. So we know that the Empire State Building is a landmark and it's officially recorded as such in the DOB dataset. It's not grandfather, it's not city owned, so on and so forth. We can definitely play with this also in the scavenger hunt. And then there's also a special district it's in the special district called Midtown. This affects, different types of tax levels. It's not located, in anything that's affected by all of these environmentally protected areas or any sort of major hazards are going to happen to the building. And then at the bottom is where you get to see all the elevator records, electrical applications, permits, plumbing inspections, so on and so forth. And we're going to come to the complaints section because that's always fun. And so here are all the complaints that have been lodged, that have been made against the Empire State Building. There are many pages of this, obviously. But the one I thought was particularly funny was this one made January 3rd, 2017. And it's at the Empire State Building. Most of the floors were complete trash. It is a hazard. Also, the security guard let callers scan through packages out of 20. Seems like there should be better security. So there's all sorts of interesting information that you can see in the Department of Buildings information. Some are a lot more serious, some are quite funny. And so this is something that we'll definitely play with as well during the scavenger hunt.